What does it mean to be a truly great thinker, especially in the world of Chat GPT and everything being a finger's snap away? Well, today I sit down with David Adams. Now, David is the CEO of an amazing organization called the Urban Assembly, which is challenging the way that we push out thinkers into this new, ever changing landscape of society. We're going to hear about David's philosophy on social emotional learning. We're going to talk about the role of artificial intelligence in the education experience. We're going to talk about creative thinking, problem solving, and a growth mindset, plus so much more. You guys are absolutely going to love this episode. Let's get after it with David.
Our job is to show what right looks like, to inspire others to adopt new ways of thinking in order to produce young people who can solve problems for themselves and problems for the world. And to the extent that we got on top of the AI work, it's for the same reasons that we got on top of our social emotional learning work and our post-secondary readiness work, because it works. This is the work that's going to help change and transform what it means to be educated in 2024 and beyond. And we're just very proud to help schools see what that looks like in their own institutions.
David, in our previous conversation, you said there's a huge difference between how the schools are organized and what the labor market expects. What's going on there?
Well, the schools are organized around really discrete academic content tasks. We're talking about things like how well students engage in discourse, or how will they kind of work around content-oriented things, how fast they can solve equations in math, or maybe even their persistence if you're getting up to some of the performance tasks. When we go out to the industry, we're really talking about integrated knowledge. How students take information from different disciplines and content areas and apply those to problem solving, usually in a group or community, right? And so they're going to be pulling from different kinds of skills. They're looking at communication skills. How well do you communicate your point of view in a group who may have different or diverse points of view than you? We're also looking at your ability to deal with difference and diversity in order to get the best final product. So essentially, we're looking at the difference between discrete bodies of knowledge that students are tested on that demonstrate their mastery of content, and the application of that content through processes like communication and collaboration and problem solving in order to solve for what we call nebulous problem sets. In schools, I was talking to one of our students the other day, and I said, "What kind of problems do you solve?" And they said, "Math problems." And I was like, "Any other kind of problems?" They're like, "No." And I was like, "You never have problems with people?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, all the time." But our students are so oriented to this notion that problems have equal signs attached to them that they forget that most of the things that they struggle with, oftentimes in schools, are not the ones that are equation based, but the ones that are people based. Over in the real world, we got a lot of people-based problems. We have problems around how to work with people, how to take in an operational environment that's constantly changing, and how to solve against solutions that don't have really clear, discrete solutions to them, but are the result of people working together in order to come up with new ways to solve problems and move us forward.
Man, it sounds like this is exactly the type of innovation we need at the foundational level to be able to prepare people to go into the next phase of life, which is beyond school. I can't tell you how many people I've had in my personal life and people I've come across in my time who have been so frustrated where they've been incredibly good at applying themselves to doing well on the test, but as soon as they graduate and get into the real world, there's no more tests, and they don't really know how to quantify their ability to navigate different problems. Why do we keep seeing this in education, or at least how we've known it for so long?
Well, you just said it so well, Keenan. We have a school system that is preparing students for a life of tests rather than the test of life. And that's a quote taken from Dr. Maurice Elias. And we're talking about things that are discrete and easily measurable, as opposed to the actual challenges that we have in the real world. We are a large system in public education, and we are accountable to our taxpayers and to the tax base and to the government. And so there are questions around how do you address that accountability? And the current solution is around mostly standardized testing. And there are strengths to standardized testing, right? You can do it at a large scale. The results are discrete and they're clear. You can get a number that demonstrates how well a student is doing a certain thing. But some of the challenges are also as clear. The way that standardized tests tend to evaluate young people is based on what they know. And most of what they can demonstrate in terms of what they do is the application of what they know to really discrete problem sets that are organized on that test, right? Reading comprehension, you have a short passage, and then you take in and you ask questions around that passage to demonstrate your ability to comprehend knowledge. Now, in the real world, we have multivariable challenges that are not so discrete and are not so focused on what you know, but are much more focused on how you operate under conditions of stress and emotionality. The difference between studying out of a textbook around anatomy and doing surgery is a big difference. One is what you know, and the other is how do you apply that knowledge under conditions of stress and emotionality in order to solve problems. Now, in 2024, 2025, and 2030, and 2035, we're going to continually put on our young people the ability to demonstrate, perform tasks in order to take what they know and show what that means in terms of a task performance. That's not the same as how we measure in education. Uh, so that's why we need to think about it that way.
So, the work that you guys are doing at the Urban Assembly, you've been a part of the organization for 10 plus years now. And you said you got into the organization where identified as being a problem solver. And that's why you've been able to ascend to CEO. So, huge congratulations on your amazing work in the organization.
Thank you.
But what are the big problems that David has been set out to solve for the assembly as a whole? What kind of challenges are we tackling out here?
Well, we look at four different areas when we think about scalable solutions here at the Urban Assembly. Our work has been focusing on identifying generalizable problems from our 22 Urban Assembly design schools and then scaling solutions from our schools to all schools. So the first area that we look to do that in is social and emotional learning. And the question is how to ensure that schools are organized around the principles of social and emotional development. And so some solutions that we've organized around there have been focusing on a program called the Resilient Scholars Program, which allows us to scan for social and emotional outcomes against instructional practices and behavioral supports, social emotional supports, extracurricular activities. So schools have a really cohesive sense of where they can support students' social and emotional development and the capacity of their system to do that. And the other thing that we're looking at is post-secondary readiness. And so we have a new tool called Counselor GPT. And the problem we're solving there is how to ensure that students have enough information about their post-secondary outcomes that allow them to make good decisions. So we're doing everything from looking at labor market analysis to looking at return of investment. And then we're building a chatbot that would allow students to have these conversations on a consistent basis. So we're no longer constrained by the number and the ratio of college counselors or post-secondary counselors in a school. The last thing we're doing is we're looking at this question of how to support instructional quality at scale. And our solution there is called Project Cafe, the classroom automated feedback environment, where teachers are getting consistent feedback around high quality interactions, thereby allowing them to get more frequent feedback more effectively and improve their practice. When you put all those things together, we think about continuous improvement. How do we ensure that schools have access to continuous improvement? And that means removing constraints around labor by utilizing technology, removing constraints around knowledge by bringing artificial intelligence to bear directly to students, and removing constraints about resources by ensuring that the price point for all these solutions are things that schools can pay for.
We got to dive into this because through my experience and talking to leaders in higher education and education in general, there's two sides of the camp. One is artificial intelligence, no place for that in our education system because it's going to be used and abused and people are just going to cheat. The other side is through a lens of curiosity and saying, how do we leverage this technology to help us be more effective? Why did you guys come out on the latter side of the coin rather than saying absolutely not happening here?
Well, I bet you are on the latter side of that same coin just by having our little bit of a conversation. But ostensibly, we have an opportunity here to scale solutions. And oftentimes in the UA, we really think about four constraints that really make it hard to scale solutions and or actually to improve outcomes in schools. And we think about knowledge constraints and we think about resource constraints. We think about incentive constraints. And then we think about like, how do we take these ideas and these constraints and then solve for them? So at the artificial intelligence space, we have the ability to solve for a number of these constraints. We can work with students to individualize the quality of their tasks. We can work with teachers to focus on lesson planning at scale. We can focus on teachers in terms of giving them feedback. We can think about how to increase the interactions between students and college and post-secondary knowledge. So if you abstract these notions a little bit beyond the current state around teacher slash educator student exchanging information in a learning environment, then you have this whole new set of options with AI, because who and where the student is interacting with in order to develop their sense of the concept that we're trying to teach can be everything from a teacher, a peer, a machine learning algorithm, a AI tutor, an encyclopedia. All these things open the realm of possibilities in terms of what students can succeed at. And so we need to move from this notion that the constraint of time or the constraint of knowledge or the constraint of incentives are going to stop us from innovating. They're going to stop us from solving problems. We're looking for solutions, and AI is just one of those tools that we're looking to allow us to make that work.
How do you get I'm going to say this with all due respect, but like a legacy system like education to be on the bleeding edge of how we can implement this technology? Because we're barely 2 years in now with the emergence of OpenAI and GPTs and all these things. So how did you guys move so quickly in this direction?
Well, first, the good news is that education is actually the fourth highest adopter of AI technology across industries. And so we're seeing some really high adoption rates in the educational space. Here at the Urban Assembly, we were specifically designed to be an innovation lab to get ahead of the adoption curve, make sure that we understand the use cases, know what challenges are facing our schools, and then expose our schools to solutions that can help them be successful. Our job is to show what right looks like, to inspire others to adopt new ways of thinking in order to produce young people who can solve problems for themselves and problems for the world. And to the extent that we got on top of the AI work, it's for the same reasons that we got on top of our social emotional learning work and our post-secondary readiness work, because it works. This is the work that's going to help change and transform what it means to be educated in 2024 and beyond. And we're just very proud to help schools see what that looks like in their own institutions.
I want to talk a little bit about social emotional learning, and I want you kind of to level set and educate the audience on why this is something that is important. I want to start with a little example. I had the privilege of interviewing a brain surgeon with a PhD in neuroscience, and I asked him the one question, which was, what is the most important skill set a human can develop? He said, emotional regulation. Now, coming from his highly specified skill set, you would think he would have been like, how to operate on somebody, break open the spine, be able to do surgery, and get highly compensated for it. But he said emotional regulation. Why did he say that?
Well, I mean, emotional regulation and self management in particular has a lot of predictors in terms of life effects and life satisfaction. One of your most famous studies here is going to be Walter Mischel. It's called the marshmallow test, where he gave young people marshmallows. And saw how long they were able to resist those marshmallows, and looked at a lot of predictions based on how well they were able to resist the marshmallow and eat it. But this is a really robust finding. Everything from your kindergarten self-regulation uh, strategies, predicting your 12th grade SATs, to more recent work around goal-directed behavior, which is a subset of self-regulation and emotional regulation, and looking at students' academic outcomes. The other thing to think about, if you're thinking about life satisfaction, is a lot of what we call mood disorders on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM, are looking at challenges of emotional upregulation or downregulation, right? So in depression or anxiety, or depression in particular, that's an upregulation challenge. We're challenging upregulating our emotions. For anxiety, downregulating emotions against a task or a goal. So our goal or job here as human beings is to problem solve through all the challenges that we have, and our internal state being one of them. So I assume your neuroscientist friend is identifying that the most successful people are the most successful at upregulating or downregulating their emotional state in order to achieve a goal or a task, and be successful at that space. And so everything from academic outcomes to relationship skills to your job satisfaction are related to your ability to regulate your emotions effectively. Now, let me just say one more thing on this. Sometimes folks think that managing your emotions is all about down regulating and just not expressing your emotions. And the analogy that I use is a well managed store. So when you come to a well managed store, let me take a step back. When you come into an unmanaged store, it usually means that things are out of place. And people are not helping you when they're supposed to help you. You can't find things. right? You don't have an effective experience in that store. But when you go to a well-managed store, you know where things are. You can find them easily. Your checkout experience is well placed, and your emotional space is the same way. A well-managed emotional experience is when you're able to do the things that you want to do, given the tasks that you're trying to accomplish and the emotional state that you're trying to achieve.
Amazing analogy. My brain naturally went to the place of why this work is so important today. So I bring up this book every once in a while on the podcast called Indistractable. Now, this individual wrote a book, and in this book, he talks about one of the biggest threats that we have to our society today is the inability for us to be able to regulate our emotions. And he talks about the role that this little device is playing in this grand scheme of deregulating our emotions. He says, every single time, if you go out into society today, even anybody who's listening to this podcast, next time you're in a social setting, the store, the gym, wherever it is, whenever somebody feels uncomfortable, the natural reaction that we've built through habit is pulling out our device and looking for a sense of escapism. The inability to regulate our emotions, that feeling of uncomfortableness in the moment, and escape from it. How do you kind of think about the swirling impact of these behaviors that have been ingrained into our society by incredibly smart, well-funded companies to keep us going back to their device instead of
Mm.
dealing with the emotions in the moment? And what is the big tail of that?
Man, that's a great question. So there's a couple of different parts that I want to untangle. The first is dealing with uncomfortability. Now, Jonathan Haidt just put out a book, obviously, The Coddling of the American Mind, right, which talks about smartphones and its impact on mental health. And some of the ideas here is this notion of being uncomfortable. And how do we teach young people how to manage through that sense of uncomfortableness? Because it's in that space of uncomfortableness that we grow. In education, we have this notion called productive struggle. It's based on Vygotsky, who was a researcher or a psychologist in the 1900s, and he talks about the zone of proximal development, which is the space where you are uncomfortable with the task, but can access a trusted peer and adult to help you move through and grow in terms of your cognitive and social emotional space. And that's where learning happens. If you're too low, below the zone of proximal development, you're not learning, you're bored. If you're too high, you're frustrated, right? And so a lot of teaching is around organizing tasks and supports so that students are right in that zone of proximal development, so that they're engaged in a task but not overwhelmed by the rigor of it. So our social lives are the same way. All things being equal, folks want to be comfortable. All things being equal, folks prefer people who remind them of themselves. All things being equal, we like things that make us feel comfortable and remind us of what we already know. And if we stay in that space, then not only are we not creating connections and growing socially, but we are kind of like limiting and narrowing our experience emotionally as well, and cognitively. And so, to the extent that we are reorganizing our attention to inanimate objects like phones rather than animate objects like our relationships, our partners, like opportunities to grow, like books and literature that are different from us and move us into a different way of thinking and being, then we are limiting who we are and who we will become. So, I think that the point that you made is really well taken with regards to social media and cell phones. There's pretty good evidence that we continue to narrow our locus and our aperture towards things that reflect us back to ourselves. And that's never the way to grow. We need to be at our zone of proximal development. We need to be growing. We need to be seeing people who are different from us, having perspectives that are different from us. That's going to challenge us social, emotionally, and academically to be the best versions of ourselves.
There's an interesting way in which these algorithms work today as well, where they keep us in the same sense of cognitive bundles, right? The more we look out into the world, especially the mirror of social media, the more we'll see where our attention flows. And I do worry about the long-term impacts of those type of macro behaviors only showing us and reinforcing exactly what we're looking for instead of those different perspectives that you're talking about in the curriculum of
Yeah,
conflict and
yeah.
healthy, I would say, the acceptance of different ideas. It seems like we are, from a monetization perspective in society today, enabling us with tools that push us in a very narrow-sided direction that is not going to be beneficial when we get out into the world as adults, but also have to navigate the changing landscape of how everything's changing so quick.
Yeah, I mean, you said it perfectly. Look, there's a reason why cities tend to be more innovative than inland areas, and it's not because the coastal waters make folks any smarter, but it's the influx of diversity, different ideas. Um, being exposed to each other, that's what really drives innovation. And the difference between cities and areas that are more isolated is that there's less access to those ideas. You have more of the same people around, and so there's less diversity of thought, and so the innovation doesn't happen. We need our people, our young people, we need our adults, we need our citizenry to be exposed to different ideas, so they're used to reasoning through the quality of those ideas and then coming up with the ones that they think best suits the solution that they're trying to develop. We feel comfortable. Our default is to feel or is to hear things that make us feel good about ourselves. That's great, right? Like, yeah, I thank you. I appreciate
I
that
love
feedback,
that. Yeah.
right? Yeah, wow, yes, thank you, algorithm, right? But it's like sugar and sweets, but for your social, emotional, cognitive development, right? Sugar tastes good, salt tastes good, right? And in small pieces, it's good for you. But in fact, like you want to have a high quality, nutritious diet in your body, and you want to have a high quality, nutritious, social, emotional, and cognitive landscape in order to develop who you are as a person and who we are as a society.
When it comes to how you guys are influencing the next generation of thinkers, I want to ask you a question. Earlier in our conversation, you had mentioned that often the education system from where we've come from taught us to solve problems that were tied to an equation. The variables were set. But now we're seeing the world as it's progressing, as it's changing. So many things are in flux. We're often having to, I would say, solve complex problems. How are you helping the students understand what a complex problem is compared to where we came from in education with solving those single variable outcomes and problems that we were trying to solve?
Well, here at the Urban Assembly, we've been investing in thinking through the kind of learning tasks that really move young people to think very hard about solutions. And that means everything from cooperative learning and project-based learning to more specific kind of opportunities of group work that allow students to really think through a solution to something that's not obvious. We're very, very focused on student discourse with the idea that students talking to each other drives understanding and drives learning and also drives the type of collaboration skills that they'll need not only in work but in life in terms of civic development. And lastly, we've been really thinking about how to give teachers the kinds of feedback at a rate of frequency that can help them see how much time students are talking versus how much time teachers are talking, so that they can think about what kind of tasks, what kind of questions can I organize for students so this is a high quality learning experience. We're not there yet. We're going to continue to move there. We're very excited about New York State's Blue Ribbon Commission and how they are re-envisioning what it means to be educated in New York State and moving a little bit away, hopefully, from standardized tests as the only outcome of a high quality education, to looking at things like portfolios and looking at things like interviews. But at the end of the day, when we're working with our staff and when we're working with our principals, our goal is to help create learning experiences for young people where they're talking to each other, talking to their teacher, and talking to the text in a way that really promotes high quality thinking.
You know, in our previous conversation, you had mentioned a very interesting experiment, or maybe there was something that happened where somebody unfortunately had a traumatic brain injury, and they no longer had the ability to access their emotions. Now, earlier in our conversation, we talked about emotional regulation. The misconception is diminish your emotions, submit them to the point where they don't really impact you. But is there a negative side in being able to not make decisions when we don't have our emotions? What's that look like?
Well, you just said it. So there was a group of folks who had a specific brain injury, and this was most recently covered. I think it's called "In the Moral Mind." I have to check that out, right? But and so what happens is that decision making is a lot worse, right? Because emotions are information. They give you information about the environment and yourself. And they show you what you should be attending to. They identify danger in the space, and so when folks actually don't have any access to the emotional center of their brain, they make really poor decisions. And some of that is because they don't know how to start things, they don't know how to stop things, they don't know what to attend to, what not to attend to. Emotional intelligence is not about suppressing emotions. It's about channeling emotions effectively towards a goal, taking the information from your emotions that you're supposed to, and then using that to accomplish a goal or a task. And so if you suppress your emotional response, then you're losing all the information that emotions are telling you about yourself and the world. But if you are not aware of your emotional response and you let your emotional response overwhelm your ability to reason through situations, then you may not be responding in line with what you're trying to accomplish. So that balance is about being aware, understanding and labeling and expressing and regulating the ruler model coming out of Yale, so that folks can act with intention and accomplish the goals that they're trying to accomplish.
This the ability to understand our emotions, I feel like for generations, especially from a masculine perspective, has always been looked at as a vulnerability instead of a skill set that we can develop. So, how much of responsibility is put on education systems like you guys to help
Mhm.
us be able to identify, label, and understand our emotions compared to the conversations that maybe our students are having at home? Because it seems like you guys can talk about this all the time, but if these things aren't reinforced in the home, isn't it difficult to get across some of these, I would say, applications in real life if mom and dad or people around us don't have the same type of understanding of our emotions?
Yes, yes, it is. It is challenging. And what I'd say here is that the ability to problem solve and the ability to take in emotional information and act upon it are intimately linked, right? I'm sure you know folks growing up who were reckless, who just felt something and did it, right? And I can imagine the implications of of that. I know I have folks growing up doing the same. So I do agree with you that I think that there is a version of masculinity that says emotions are always to be suppressed and never to be understood. But I think that if you take it seriously, we're talking about a version of masculinity who are able, that incorporates this notion that I will communicate well, that I will act with an intention, that I can understand the intention of others, right, against a situation, even conditions of stress and emotionality. And so I'm more effective at my goal. Look, I have 21 years in the Army Reserve. And I will tell you, as a civil affairs officer, one of the things that we were trained upon was how to listen well. We were actually sat down and given a test on how well we can take in information and reflect that information around our constituency, because our job is to build rapport and to build trust, right? So I think if we look at these things as they are, which are skills to be developed, then they are raised in importance. Not that we need to indulge in emotional states for the sake of just indulging in them, but that we take in information, and folks who do that better are better able to problem solve. Folks who do that better are better able to communicate. And I don't think there's anything more masculine than communicating well and problem solving in order to achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. It's the skill set is going to be so much more valuable here in the future. I was listening to a conversation on a Joe Rogan podcast where this guy named Chamath, can't I'm not going to be able to say his last name unfortunately without it in front of me. He was talking about in the future, with the prevalence of artificial intelligence and everything else that's going to come into our lives, we're going to see a huge demand for the ability to think appropriately. Because if you have AI and everything, all these different agents who can handle all of the redundant work that is not high leverage, then how are we going to be able to position our students, but more importantly, our teachers, as people that are in high, I would say, authority in our society because they're helping our children learn how to think, not just memorize and regurgitate. And that's kind of where I feel like the beautiful intersection of artificial intelligence and education is going to come together, is our
Mhm.
teachers are now going to be responsible to helping our students think about how they solve problems rather than just solving the problem.
Yeah, I can say it better. We are already at that place. If you look at how education has changed, I think in the last 20 years or so, there's been a stronger emphasis on thinking processes. There's a perennial argument in education around content and skills in terms of, do you need to learn things or do you need to know processes? And the answer is both, right? Because we learn how to think with content and through content. To the extent that you have a strong vocabulary has been and perennially is a great predictor for IQ, just because, from my perspective, the larger of a tapestry you have to describe the world, the easier it is to create insights around it, right? The easier it is to actually understand it and make decisions around it and process information quickly. So the future of education is going to be one in which we continue to help young people um, reason and discern about themselves in the world. And I just want to throw one more idea at you, Kenan. This is like not just about the educational process. If you look at the disinformation approaches from different countries trying to influence our election, they are often emotionally based, right? They target folks' emotions in order to create a response that may or may not be in tune or in line with the intent of the person. So when we're thinking about what kind of person is educated in 2024 and beyond, and what does it mean to be educated, we're talking about a person who can understand truth from fiction, regardless of the actor who is giving it to us, who can discern patterns, right, across a range of different content and domains. A person who can collaborate effectively in order to put in information to an ecosystem and get something bigger than what they put in individually. And a person who is able to really like see beauty in the world and see beauty in themselves, right? Because they have a sense of what beauty looks like and feels like. And this is not unrelated to your times table, but it's not limited to your times table. It's not unrelated to your reading fluency, but it's bigger than that. We're talking about a whole person going out into the world, participating in self governance, solving problems on behalf of our community, having great relationships, going to work, providing value, coming home, being a great father, son, brother, sister, etc., and overwhelmingly just living a good life.
I mean, this is the skill set of the future. You know, as I'm sitting here thinking to you, I think we've had the fortune of looking at the last, we'll call it decade of time, as it moved so quickly that we didn't have the skill sets to truly understand what was happening around us. Even today, as I think about being a critical thinker and being able to discern if information is valid or trustworthy, you have that
Mm-hmm.
little intuition that goes off in your head. Even when you see political campaigns today, it's like, I understand why you did that, and I understand the emotional like string that you're pulling on to get the reaction out of me. And it's that critical thinking skill of the world, and as information is constantly being bombarded towards you, that I feel like is going to be the next skill set that is worth developing, rather than just coming from this place of all consumption and trusting everything that comes at you, because we don't live in that world anymore.
I mean, that's the bottom line. That's the bottom line. We have the ability to reproduce faces and reproduce voices. We have the ability to certainly place pictures of trusted officials in different places that they may or may not actually been in. And so, like this idea of perspective taking, like, what is it that people want me to feel in the situation, and why would somebody want me to feel that way? Um, Being able to identify appeal to emotion versus appeal to rationality, knowing that our emotions and our rationality are interconnected, right? That we have a thing called motivated reasoning, where we tend to reason towards a predetermined end state that is emotionally satisfying. And we're using our really cognitive capacities, not really to identify all the possible alternatives of why information is, but mostly to push our thinking to make us feel good about a thing that we want already to occur. And so these are all the biases and the challenges that we have around reasoning that are moving us against critical thinking, right? That constrain our ability to see and discern effectively. And so part of the purpose of education is to reduce our error in that thinking process and to increase our accuracy so that we're able to see cause and effect effectively in order to better understand ourselves and the world. And that's why when we talk about an emotional education and a social and emotional education, folks who have that apparatus, who have those assets, will be able to better understand themselves and the world as compared to folks who haven't had that opportunity to develop those skills.
How do you look at this responsibility that's in front of you right now? With how quickly the world is changing and how quickly society is changing around you, you have a fundamental place in the lives of helping the youth perceive, view, and discern how the world is coming at them.
Mm-hmm.
How do you kind of think about this responsibility? Do you look at it as a challenge, or do you think it's an opportunity for us to be able to get this next generation of people ready to kind of go out into the world and navigate?
I mean, it's a challenge and an opportunity, right? Look, I know sometimes folks are down on the American education system, and I understand it, and we have a lot of ways to go. But I want to remind us all that we are still the most innovative country in the world. Our economy bounced back very quickly after COVID as compared to many other industrialized countries because we're flexible people. We're a flexible country with flexible understandings of ourselves and who we want to be. So we're doing something right in terms of who we are as Americans, and we need to capitalize on that. We need to capitalize on the kinds of innovations that the American political system or the American educational system or the business system or all of those systems put together kind of organize to make us who we are. So the opportunity here is to continue that tradition, to continue the tradition of being flexible problem solvers, taking our mental faculties and applying them to solutions that may not be obvious if you had not sat down and put an equal sign in front of it. Our opportunity in the educational system is not to be afraid of the new innovations as they come, and really embrace this notion of what it means to be a people who are self-governing in terms of what we give in terms of learning experiences. And then the opportunity is to look at our education system as it is today, take what's working, expand on that, and then move against what's not, so that our young people will be the folks that you just talked about, ready to whirl, innovative problem solvers.
You know, you said in our previous conversation, if we graduate students with straight A's and they collapse at the first moment of adversity, we have failed. And I feel like that has been a large, I would say, playbook for education as we're pumping out people. They perform incredibly well at all these tests. You guys graduate with straight A's, go out into the world. And now you graduate from college as an example, and 54% of college graduates are working jobs with a high school degree, which is necessary. So
Yeah.
why do you think it's so important to pump out resilient students, even if they're not getting straight A's on their tests? It seems like
Mhm.
the standard of ready for the world is being reallocated and kind of shaped with the work that you guys are doing.
The way to solve problems is to be persevering, and persevering through problem solving. I don't know an employer who I have met who says, I don't want flexible, persevering problem solvers who work well with other people. I'll teach them everything else, right? I mean, obviously, we have our baselines. We need high quality literacy in our schools so folks can take in information and understand the world through the verbal and written space. We need a basic level of numeracy so they understand how to manipulate numbers and translate the world into symbols. But at the end of the day, we need folks who can solve problems, and solving problems is not easy. If it was, they wouldn't be called problems; they'd just be called playthings, right? So, what makes to me America great is our perseverance in solving problems, right? I mean, man, not only did we put a man on the moon and invent airplanes, we had young people move out through the civil rights movement and reimagine what our country could be. We continue to think about, like, what does it mean to invent everything from generative AI to other areas of our economy in terms of tech and social media, for better or for worse. This takes resilience. And I'm not even talking about the mental health aspect of this, right? It takes resilience to solve problems. You got to stick with it. So to the extent that people are like, hey, if this election doesn't go my way, I'm leaving. That's a loser. That's a failure for us. That's a loss. To the extent that people are like, this hurts in terms of my ability to stick with the problem, I'm not going to work on it. That's a loss for us. To the extent that folks spend a career thinking through how to improve our ability to decode the human genome, that can't be taken away from us. I'll throw one last example to you. The Enlightenment Now is a book by Steven Pinker, man, and he goes through all these great examples of just human ingenuity. And one of the things that he did, he talks about, was just decoding the wheat genome in order to increase the yield of wheat for people to eat. And I don't remember the scientist who did this, but he spent his entire life working on this one problem set, and as a result, folks have much more food to eat than they'd had in our history. And so that's the kind of innovation it takes to move our society forward. And those are the kinds of young people I'd be excited to help produce as the CEO of Urban Assembly.
And those individuals have what we talked about in our previous conversation, which is a mindset that can overcome challenges. We use the example of the growth mindset from Carol Dweck at the University of Stanford and why that's so important. I gave you an example of when we have students who come through a reinforced system like education, where the only objective for them is to memorize and regurgitate information on a test so they can get an A. And then they get out into the real world and they come across the application of this knowledge and they're not as good. It's easy for these students to become incredibly discouraged and frustrated because they're not being validated at the same way. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of a growth mindset, especially as students get out into this world that is changing from year to year, and the playbook has to be reinvented time and time again.
Man, like you just said it really well again, that the world is changing from year to year and the playbook has to be reinvented. This is not a question of like how to describe the ventricles of the heart, right? There is an answer to that. And that answer is important. This is more like, can you be on a residency as a doctor, working off of 4 or 5 hours of sleep, and then still perform the task that you were trained under effectively? So the challenge goes back to this idea of knowing versus doing. Knowing is important. Becoming less and less important, but is still important, because to the extent that you know, you can refine your ability to do. Right, knowing is what's training your mind, but is insufficient in actually applying that knowledge in order to solve problems. Most problems are not clean problems, because if they were already solved. Right, most problems are not obvious problems, and if they are, somebody's already solved them. In order to innovate, in order to produce value in our society, we need to solve new problems. And some of these problems are social. How to work with a multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy, and still have a coherent society. It's a big problem set. In fact, not one that has been historically done. Most societies were not multi-ethnic, multiracial, and multi-religious. They were homogenous, right? Relatively speaking. How to work in order to produce value, given the relationship between generative AI and our legacy systems of content development and problem solving, right? There is not an answer to that like you just like calculate for X. You know what I mean? Like, you got to really figure that out. So we got to produce dynamic young people who are comfortable, I should say, with ambiguity. And this is something I don't think we're doing such a good job at, I should say. I think our young people are tending to see the world as good and bad, and black and white, and easy or hard. They are struggling to really see nuance. They're struggling to really understand how to think when there is not a clear answer. And this is politically, this is socially, this is in the context of problem solving. And the feedback that I continually receive from our business and industry partners is that when problems come their way, they are struggling to persevere through them. So we got some work to do in our educational space, and I accept that challenge in producing the kinds of young people who I want on my team. I hire folks all the time here at the Urban Assembly, and I want young people who are resilient, who can solve problems, who are collaborative, and who don't need step-by-step instruction to getting from point A to point Z in order to add value to our organization.
You said it so succinctly there, and I'm going to steal this from you. The easy problems have already been solved. The problems that we're dealing with today are complex, and they take complex problem solving in order to be able to get us a solution that's going to be able to benefit everybody. And that's a really interesting way to kind of think about, as society continues to progress, the problems are just harder because all the easy ones have already been taken out by the people before. That's an interesting perspective I haven't really thought about.
That's why I love when we talk about the American experiment, right? Like, I'm talking about young people, it's like an American experiment. We were trying to do something. We are trying to do something, but it's not obvious that it's going to work. Yeah. So like, between the revolution and today, like, we got to solve all these problems to maintain this question of who we want to be as a society and how we want to be as we the people that they talk about in the Constitution.
David, as we kind of put the landing gear down here, our previous guest wanted to ask you a blind question. Their question was, what is the best piece of advice you've ever got?
All right. The best piece of advice I've ever got is don't drink and drive.
There you go. Yeah.
Let me just plug this my computer for a second. Just real talk. Like, make good decisions. Call people up if you need them. And just use what you have in front of you rather than making poor decisions. So honestly, when I was in high school, this is a true story. I asked my high school teacher, I was like, can you give me some advice in terms of how to be the best version of myself? And he's like, you're a good guy. Don't drink and drive. And then that was it. And I took that advice, and I'm not saying that helped me be CEO, but it didn't hurt.
And sometimes that's what it's as simple about, right, David? I mean, like, we have to recognize that the decisions that we make, as small as they may seem, have the ability to change the trajectory of our life. And so I love the advice that you were given. I think that's an amazing place for us to be.
But you made that sound so much more profound than I did, and I appreciate that, Keenan. Thank you.
That's why we're here, baby.
Thank you.
Well, David, man, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, brother. I really appreciate the time. Is there anything that you want to say as a closing mark of somebody who's leading the next generation of great thinkers into the future?
Hey man, I think we all have an opportunity to do the work. So whether you are in school, whether you have a child in school, whether you know somebody in school, just continue to put pressure on our systems to produce young people who will contribute to our societies. And if we do that, then we will think about what this new American experiment will be for our generation and next generation to come.
There we go, guys. That's a wrap.